Alright, today we are ranking all the B&Ms that I've ridden, so I don't want to waste your time, so let's get into last place, which is Vortex at Carowinds. This is one of B&M's stand-up coasters, and I think this was one of their third roller coasters, or it was their third roller coaster, and it just wasn't my type of ride. I mean, it hasn't aged very well. I mean, it's a stand-up coaster, and combined with its somewhat roughness and really intense helices and inversions, it's just not my type of ride. It wasn't really, not fun or anything, but it just wasn't my type of ride. Next up is Patriot at California's Great America. This is kind of like Vortex, except it's a sit-down coaster and it has no forces. I don't know what it is about when you're standing up and you feel forces more, but Vortex is extremely intense, and this ride is nothing. It's just a sit-down looper, and there's nothing interesting about it, except for maybe the snap and the corkscrew, but besides that, it's just a decent looper. It was kind of boring. Moving on to Patriot's older brother, we have Firebird, and this was the first ever B&M. And this ride was actually originally a stand-up coaster like Vortex at Carowinds, and the same goes along with Patriot at Great America. And yeah, as you can probably tell, I prefer it as a sit-down coaster more. But this ride is kind of like Patriot, but just bigger and better in every way. It is noticeably more rally. The tracking is really smooth, but at some points there's just random jolts, which kind of give a little head banging, but besides that, it's a decent ride. Next up is Batman the Dark Knight at Six Flags New England. This ride is kind of like the older B&Ms, except it was made newer, and besides barely having forces, this ride just doesn't have any forces at all, but I'll still appreciate some better track profiling, I guess. Moving away from the super old B&Ms, next up we have Scream at Six Flags Magic Mountain. I always hear that some people find this ride rattly and not that fun, and I also hear that some people really like this ride, and I just think it's kind of in the middle. It's not underrated or overrated, but it gives somewhat decent forces. At least it's better than the rides before this, and it's also a decent size bigger and has a lot more inversions, so that always is a plus. I also hear a lot of people complaining about the parking lot setting, which I honestly, I can see, but it doesn't really bother me that much. Next up, we have, unsurprisingly, a clone of Scream, or actually, Scream was a clone of this ride, and this ride came first, is Medusa at Six Flags Great Adventure. Scream is basically a mirrored version of this, and though Medusa runs slower because it trims harder on the mid-course brake run, it makes up for that with an amazing setting in the woods. And though I don't mind the not-so-harsh rattle on Scream, this ride runs significantly smoother, which I do appreciate. Next up, we have our first invert on the list. This is Silver Bullet at Knott's Berry Farm. I find this ride really intense in positives, but not so whippy. What I don't get is when people call this ride forceless. This ride is certainly not forceless. It has a lot of positives. But B&M inverts, usually they're really characteristic by the whip that they have on most inversions, like corkscrews and zero-G rolls. And this ride kind of just lacks it and instead has some floatiness. And that isn't a bad thing, it's just different and it's not my type of ride. Next up are the Batman cloned inverts, specifically the ones at Six Flags Magic Mountain, Six Flags Great Adventure, and Six Flags Over Georgia. These are all really small, compact, and very tight and whippy invert coasters, kind of like the exact opposite of Silver Bullet. This ride is really awesome, from the positives on the loops to the negatives and whip on the zero-G rolls and corkscrews, and the upwards helix after the second vertical loop is really intense. And this ride, honestly, is just packed so much full of forces, it's insane. Next up is Green Lantern at Six Flags Great Adventure, and let me tell you, this is how you make a stand-up coaster, not that Vortex Carowinds crap. Super intense, but not overly intense so it's uncomfortable. It gives a tiny bit of head banging, but it's nothing to complain about. The elements are all paced really well. The filler elements in between the inversions are also really great, such as the twisted hill before the mid-course brake run. And even the second half with the corkscrews, it doesn't let up. The drop off the mid-course brake run gives really good airtime, and just the whole ride in general is awesome. Let me tell you, this next ride is how you make a stand-up better. This is Riddler's Revenge at Six Flags Magic Mountain, and this is the largest stand-up coaster in the world, and this is one of the best rides I've also ever ridden. This ride is insane. Imagine everything I said about Green Lantern, but just better in every way. It's smoother, it's taller, faster. All the inversions give really good positives on the valleys and really good floats at the top. The filler elements are even better, and the corkscrews are just absolutely insane on a stand-up. Like, this ride is awesome. And not to mention, drop off the mid-course, that one camelback, chef's kiss. Next up, we're going back to Six Flags Great Adventure for Superman Ultimate Flight. This is kind of just your normal, basic B&M flying coaster, and there's honestly not much special about it. It's just a drop, a pretty decent pretzel loop, and a few turns before an inversion into the brakes. Next up is the Better Medusa-themed ride by B&M, which is a floorless coaster, which is across the country from the first one. Medusa at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. This ride it runs really fast. I think this is the best floorless coaster I've been on. It's very whippy, gives some pretty good positives. It has a sea serpent roll, which is a one-of-a-kind element. And even though this ride is on a parking lot, basically just like Scream, but this is probably even worse, this ride makes it up with an awesome layout. Next up is my favorite stand-up coaster I've ever ridden, Georgia Scorcher, and this ride is honestly a masterpiece. This ride has 2 inversions, but honestly the inversions are not the special part. All of the snaps and the drops on this ride are amazing. Whip and airtime on a stand-up coaster is one of the best feelings you can ever get on a ride. And this ride has plenty moments of those. Next up is our first B&M that is outside of the US. This is Acrobat at Nagashima Spaland in Japan. Yes, there are B&Ms in Japan. This is a flying coaster, and it is a clone of, many of you will be familiar with, Manta at SeaWorld Orlando. This is a clone of that ride, and it was fine. I mean, it's definitely better than the Superman clones, obviously. It executes all of the rolls really well, like the zero-G rolls or the corkscrews and stuff like that. This ride does that really great. The pretzel loop wasn't too intense, but I did ride in row 2, so that probably explains why. The setting over the mid-course brake run and that turn over the lake is really cool with the water effect. And this ride, even though it was pretty rattly, that was probably just because of poor maintenance, and it didn't bother me that much. We are going back to the inverts with this one, and next up we have Afterburn at Carowinds. This ride I find pretty overrated, but that doesn't mean it's really bad, as I've ranked it pretty high in this list. I think that this ride, it has some really good whippy moments. I mean, the Immelman is kind of just pointless. It's just there. The zero-G roll is fine. The Batwing is probably the only really intense moment of the ride. And I found that it was kind of underwhelming due to like not having that much whip going into and out of the Batwing. The corkscrew is pretty decent. It gives some pretty harsh headbanging, which you kind of have to prepare for, but it isn't too bad. Overall, a solid invert. And after that, we have Flight Deck, aka the superior jet-themed inverted roller coaster. And this is one of my favorite roller coasters of all time. It is short but sweet, super intense. Every moment is awesome. Really good airtime on the drops and really good whip in the inversions. And that finale is one of the best finales I've ever experienced in my life. Over the lake, corkscrew, super intense helix. This ride is awesome. We are officially getting good. We are starting the tier of hyper coasters now. This is Nitro at Six Flags Great Adventure, and this is the worst hyper I've been on, period. I mean, that doesn't mean it's a bad ride, it just means that there's better rides. I find that the ride gives really good airtime on all the camelbacks. It's not like insanely good, it's just decent floater. That's kind of it. And the finale on this ride half carries the whole thing. It's just 4 straight bunny hills in a row, and it gives really good quality floater. Next up, we have another hyper, or mini hyper actually. This ride is Hollywood Dream in Universal Studios Japan. This ride is like around 135 feet tall, I think, and size does not matter. Like, honestly, this ride has some of the strongest like flowjector airtime on a B&M hyper that I've experienced, and this ride isn't even a hyper. Honestly, this is just the forward section, and when the forward section ranks this high, you know you're in for a treat. All of the airtime hills give really good floater, the ride has really good pacing, and the finale is awesome. Next up, we have another flying coaster, and this is one of the most insane flying coasters in the world. I say one of because we're going to get to that in a second, but this ride is so fun. Every single element is at least like 75 feet off the ground. And that pretzel loop is humongous. That is the best pretzel loop I've ever experienced, period. This is basically everything you could ever want in a flying coaster. This ride is almost 200 feet tall. And look at these inversions. Like, they're all so high off the ground. This is probably the closest you're ever going to get to flying, ever. Next up, we have Intimidator or Thunder Striker at Carowinds. This is another B&M hyper coaster, and this one's actually a hyper this time. And this ride is basically just Nitro, but super long trains, and it has stronger airtime. This ride is honestly as smooth as can be. It gives really good floater airtime on every single camelback, and everyone calls this ride like Intimidator or Thunder Trimmer or whatever it is now, but honestly, like, the trims barely did anything. Like, I don't know what it was about my rides compared to others, but this is definitely one of the best coasters I've ever ridden, ever. Next up, we have yet another B&M Hyper, except this one is like miles ahead of all the other B&M Hypers I've ever ridden. This is Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia, and this is definitely in my top 15 overall coasters ever. This ride basically gives flowjector to ejector, no floater airtime to be found here. This ride is awesome. Next up is Hollywood Dream at Universal Studios Japan, again, except this is the backdrop version, which means they have a train on the track that runs backwards. The seats face backwards, and you can already imagine how much that would make this ride better. This ride gives straight, like, ejector on almost every hill. Combined with that first drop and everything like that, this ride is awesome backwards. Like, I can't get enough of it. Like, people are underrating this ride so much, especially when it's backwards. Ejector, floater, drops, helices, everything all over the place when you're backwards. I don't know how people can't say that ride isn't the best. Like, honestly. Okay, fine. You probably saw this coming from a mile away. Fury 325, a B&M Giga Coaster, obviously 325 feet tall. This is the second best B&M I've ever ridden. And you might think second best. Yeah, we're getting there. But this ride is awesome. The speed, the airtime, the whip, every single element, except for like that one stupid helix, is awesome. And those camelbacks at the end, basically perfect. This ride is basically perfect, except for that helix, which is my one single complaint about it. But other than that, this ride, it's basically like the best you could ever make it to be. I wouldn't do anything to improve this ride. I think I've talked about Fury 325 enough on this channel, so I'm just going to move on to the number one spot. Come on, guys. Come on. You saw Hollywood Dream on here? You knew what was coming up. Flying Dinosaur. This ride is a flying coaster, as you can tell by the name. It's like Tatsu, but on another level. This ride has one of basically the steepest drop on a flying coaster ever. A 540-degree roll, which flips you onto your back, where you then go through a Raven turn into another pretzel loop. The only place you can ever find that is on Flying Dinosaur. Like, the only place ever. And not to mention the rest of the layout, which is also insane. There's an airtime hill on a flying coaster, which is awesome. A helix, corkscrew, that last inline twist into the brakes, that concludes the best B&M in the world. There's no other ride made by B&M that can ever top this. And I can confidently say that. Whew, that was a lot of B&Ms to take in. But, yep, there it is. Every single B&M that I have ridden ranked. I hope you enjoyed, and have a nice day.